So welcome to the Faith is Not Blind podcast. I'm Eric Devonier, and I'm here today with Professor Terryl Givens. Welcome, Terryl.
Good to be here.
Thanks for being here with us. I wanted to start just by asking you to give a little bit of introduction.
Well, my name is Terryl Givens. I am presently employed as a senior researcher at the Neal A. Maxwell Institute for Religious Scholarship, affiliated with Brigham Young University, after having just very recently retired from 30 years of teaching at the University of Richmond in Virginia. My background is in languages and literatures and intellectual history, which I studied at Cornell, and then graduated in comparative literature from Chapel Hill. And immediately had my first job teaching literature at the University of Richmond, where I was until just recently.
And so tell us a little bit. You were born in New York State?
Upstate New York.
Upstate. And then tell us a little bit about your conversion to the gospel and to the church.
Well, we had moved to Arizona, southern Arizona, when I was very young. And my father and mother joined the church when I was 8 or 9. And so I'm never sure if that qualifies me to be a convert or if that means I'm a lifelong member. But we joined at that point. It didn't take initially. We attended church for a few years and then just kind of faded out of activity. As a child, I wasn't quite sure why, still not sure of the reasons. But so for much of my childhood, we didn't really have any connection to the church. When I was 16, my father had a kind of Lehigh experience of sorts. He suddenly had the desire or the impression to move his family back east. And so I still remember as a 16-year-old, rather unhappy youth, pulling up to a campground in central Virginia, together with a large family caravan, and having the attendants ask my father, "How long are you going to be staying in our campground?" And my father said, "Until I find work." Wow. So, like Nephi, I lived in a tent. That was actually my home address for a while my father looked for work. And being kind of isolated and cut off from everything and everyone, my parents looked up the local church. So as a 16-year-old boy, my family reconnected with the church. And that was really when I began to, I think, take seriously my own religious commitment.
Well, and I think it's interesting you bring up Lehi and Nephi. I mean, so your dad, feels like he needs to move back east and is living there in the campground trying to find work. So did you feel like you had a similar experience to Nephi, where part of your conversion to the gospel it also included trying to understand maybe what your dad was seeing or what he was going through or where he had moved the family?
I think so. I think I was ready at that moment in my life, right? 16, 17, pretty formative years. You're thinking about your future in college and those kinds of things. And I was struck by the fact that my father, that his commitment turned so profound so quickly. Yeah. And it was largely a function of him really delving into Latter-day Saint doctrine and theology and being attracted to what he saw as its rational appeal. And so I immediately began to collect books, and built my own library and delved into it myself. And found very quickly a deep, lifelong commitment.
What books in particular from that time period stand out to you? Like, what were the ones that you enjoyed the most at that age?
Well, ones that would probably seem a little dated now to most people. I remember LeGrand Richards' marvelous Work and a Wonder affected me profoundly. That was the time in my life in which I read the Book of Mormon for the first time. Had a wonderful seminary teacher who was very influential. And a stake patriarch who I still revere his memory. Other than LeGrand Richards, I think it was pretty much the usual kind of thing coming from Deseret and Bookcraft, Paul H. Dunn books and the like.
And then what about your conversion itself? Did that conversion come through reading the Book of Mormon, or was it in conjunction with the other books? Or
I think it was a combination of all of them. I think I was very much entranced by the fullness, the scope, and the complexity of what Latter-day Saints call the plan of salvation, the plan of happiness. I just found it very, very intellectually appealing as a set of propositions that addressed all the great questions.
And then from there, you have that conversion that carries you through. And one of the things that we've been talking about in these podcasts is when people experience a conversion, there's usually one or many experiences that they have where that conversion gets challenged. And so for you, what was a moment in your life where that conversion got challenged or complexified in some way?
Well, I would say the great challenge, first of many, didn't come until many years later as an adult and father. I had a near-death experience, a near drowning, which I won't delve into in this context, but it was an experience that left me very unsettled and feeling quite bereft of what until then had been a number of certainties and assurances with which I lived. And I found myself at a place in my life where I was having to ask for the very first time what I think is a question that all of us need to ask at some point, and that's what is there anything that I really know with absolute certainty?
Yeah.
Very few of us can say, I know beyond any doubt that God lives or that Joseph was a prophet. Some can, to some is given that gift.
Yeah.
And I found to my surprise, but also to my comfort, that it turns out that there are some things that I knew at the deepest levels of my being. I knew that truth and fidelity and honor are good, and that cruelty and unkindness and wickedness and disloyalty are bad. And for me, starting with that certitude that our moral sensibility transcends evolutionary inheritance or socialization, was for me an indication that there is something like a veil that is permeable, that we do have access to deep truths by which to guide and live our lives. And so I began, I guess, what I would refer to as a systematic reconstituting of my faith and testimony at that point in my life that has continued to the present.
And so you talk about this systematic reconstituting, right? But how did that experience, in maybe including that or in other ways, how does that help you with your faith from that point on?
Well, I think I've become more acutely aware of the grounds of belief, and I think I have become sensitive to a greater variety of sources from which faith derives. And I guess I'll give you a few examples. I've been very deeply impressed in my life by the poet Gerard Manley Hopkins, and one of his poems, and he went through his own dark night of the soul, wrote a series of beautiful sonnets, and one of them ends, the Christ plays in 10,000 places, lovely in limbs and lovely in eyes not his, to the Father through the features of men's faces. And I have this sense, can't logically defend it, but it's just a deeply embedded sense I have that there has to be a source from which ultimate beauty and ultimate goodness come, and that I can see and sense that being transmitted or being conveyed through the beautiful acts and countenances and features of those around me who have clearly been God-touched. And so that's one example of a source of testimony that I don't think I would have thought about as a 16-year-old new convert.
Right.
But it strikes me now as a very profound catalyst to or fortification of our faith.
Yeah, that experience of beauty, right? Recognizing that it has to come from somewhere.
Yeah.
Our responses to it. Another question I have is thinking about your background, some of the things that you've written, Viper on the Hearth or By the Hand of Mormon and intellectual history. Have you encountered challenges to your testimony that have come from things that you've read or ideas that you've encountered?
Yeah, absolutely. For example, when I was writing By the Hand of Mormon, which was really a turning point, I think, in my career. I had opened the church news one day, saw that the church had just published the 100 millionth copy of the Book of Mormon, and I thought, I wonder how that compares to other bestsellers. And it turns out, as I learned very quickly, that makes it the best-selling book in American history, produced by an American. So I secured a contract from Oxford to write that book. The question then became, how do you write as an academic, for an academic audience, a book on sacred scripture? You have to effectively bracket questions of faith and supernatural origins. And so I wanted to write what we call in literature a reception history. How has the book been received, treated, packaged, understood? And I thought to do this, I wanted to read every single critical attack that had ever been leveled against the Book of Mormon. Wow. Which I knew was, could be seen as flirting with danger. Yeah. But the premise behind my project was, if the Book of Mormon can't sustain every single attack that has been launched against it, then it doesn't deserve our faith and commitment. And so I took that challenge very seriously, and beginning at 1829 and proceeding to the present, I tried to cover this vast corpus of criticism, some of it fairly superficial and silly, but some of it fairly profound and vexing. And so I found a lot of hills and valleys to my faith as I waded through that project. But in the end, I came up with a greater conviction and commitment to the Book of Mormon than I started with.
Wow. Can you think of an example of something in particular that you thought was vexing?
Well, of course, there have been many candidates that have been proffered for as having provided influence.
Right.
Some of the first ones were the Spalding manuscript of the View of the Hebrews, later a certain account of the War of 1812. And taking some phrasings in isolation, you do see what seem to be striking congruences at times, or borrowings. But I fairly soon came to a place where I believe, and continue to believe to this day, that Joseph received the impressions, he received ideas, glimpses, pictures, images, concepts, but that the Lord had to work through the cultural and intellectual vocabulary that was available to Joseph Smith. And so the particular means and wordings, I think, aren't the thing on which we should hang our faith.
Right. That's an interesting, we talk often about God having to work with our agency, but we often don't equate agency and imagination together, that God has to work with the imagination or simply just the cultural milieu.
And this is I think a source of a lot of serious misunderstanding on the part of members of the church, especially those whose faith is challenged. It's the question of, well, how could Joseph change revelations? How could there be revisions? And yet I think we've missed the point clearly, as is evident in the fact that when the church published the Joseph Smith papers, and especially when they published the facsimile version of the Doctrine and Covenants, and I love the fact that it's illustrated in 7 different colors. So you can actually see color-coded the contributions of the series of editors and collaborators that Joseph invited into participation in the project. So here's a prophet saying, I declare these to be revelations given to me by the Spirit, and yet clearly I can improve upon the wording and the phrasing and the formulation, and I invite these men to help me come closer to what I think was that essential truth toward which God was trying to move my spirit and mind. That seems to me a very humble confession and a very open and public confession on the part of Joseph Smith, that revelation is seldom perfect, and that even as a prophet, he is an imperfect, flawed mediator between God's word and his verbal expression. So, of course, it shouldn't confuse us or disappoint us if we find that even the Book of Mormon is not a literal transcript of God speaking to him through some kind of means.
Well, because how are you supposed to talk about the sublime, right? I mean, how do you get that onto a page?
Right.
How do you communicate that? It's a really, really difficult process, rather than believing that revelation is something that's dropped into your head.
Right.
And it's perfect. I often thought about that with the Kirtland Temple, right? The vision that Kirtland Temple that they have, where they get to see like every beam, and
Yeah,
and they
yeah.
get a very detailed, almost blueprint, really. Um, Maybe there are some revelations like that, but it also seems like most revelations aren't quite that detailed, and things need to be worked out and thought through.
Yeah, yeah. I think the notion of God dictating and Joseph with pen in hand as he hears the words is, in almost all cases, a little oversimplistic.
Yeah, yeah. So, thinking about your own conversion and some of those challenges and issues that have been raised, what are two or three things that you would say, um, or what are two or three things that you do or that you would say to others to help you, that helps you remain faithful, or that could help them remain faithful?
Well, it was just this past week I was reading in 2nd Nephi, and I'm coming to Lehi's sermon to his children. And he's talking about the atonement, and he's talking about the fall. And he said something which in all my readings I'd missed. Talking about Adam and Eve's decision to eat the fruit of the tree, he said if they had not eaten of the fruit of the tree, if they had not partaken, then all things would have remained in that state which they were when they were created. And I was suddenly struck by, think about what he's saying there. He's saying the worst of all possible fates and conditions would be to remain in the state in which God has created us. And so, to my mind, one of the most thrilling, exciting things about Mormonism is the fact that it is this dynamic, vital, growing, organic thing, and that God expects us to be engaged in this project of continual self-transformation and renewal. And so I hope that in 10 years, the testimony and faith and understanding I have today seems naive and simple by contrast. So I don't know where people get the idea that a testimony should be the same now and forever, and that somehow there's some kind of act of desperation involved in trying to reconstruct our testimony to meet new evidence.
Right.
No, we should always be reconstructing our testimony. I think here's one of the greatest errors of us as a people is the assumption. Think about the presumption of believing that we can become like God, right? Which is just a foundational principle of Latter-day Saint thought. Yeah. Okay, if we believe that, the sin is in thinking that distance between where we are now and where God is can be bridged by a couple of months of good home teaching and paying our tithing, right? The distance is so inconceivably immense. And so to think that we can capture in language or human conceiving at any given moment the complexity and the fullness and the richness of what it means to believe in Christ and his atonement and his gospel is just absurd and presumptuous. So of course we're just groping in the dark, trying to get some kind of a handle. It reminds me of John Keats, the poet, shortly before he died, knowing he was dying of tuberculosis, and he writes this beautiful, pathetic letter to his brother George, in which he laments his incapacity to penetrate the veil, and he talks about these faint particles of light, as he calls them, that he detects and senses and tries to grasp hold of. And I think we all need more humility when it comes to what we really mean when we say we know the gospel is true. What we mean is we have glimmerings that our heart affirms, that we have this faint grasp of some of the outlines of what it might mean to be God, or to be human aspiring to be like God, and to just be more humble about what our own limitations are at any moment, to grasp the truth and be open to change and transformation and challenges to our testimony that force us to reconceive in more interesting, complex, and sophisticated ways our faith.
So, because one thing I think that's difficult is, in order to produce the faith to do some of those things, like ministering or paying your tithing, I think people need to feel like there's more than just a glimmer. So what would you say to people that feel like they need more than a glimmering, or how can they increase those glimmers to be as faithful as they feel like they want to be or as they need to be?
Well, I guess we need to reorient ourselves. See, here's the thing: is that the Latter-day Saint tradition is rooted in such an array of wild historical claims, right? Gold plates and angels and visitations, and that we get distracted, and that becomes our focus, and that becomes our foundation. And so we lose sight of what the real purpose of religion is, right? Which is to invite us into this transformative relationship with God. And it's understandable because you can't, as some would have it, the president of the Reorganized Church once said, history as theology is perilous. Well, of course it's perilous, but we have to embrace the risk.
Right.
Because Christianity begins with a historical proposition. This man named Jesus of Nazareth was born, lived, and died. And then he came to life again at this moment in history in a real world. So you can't pretend that history isn't important. But that's not the point. Yeah. And so I guess people who are thrown for a loop because the book of Abraham wasn't translated in quite the way they thought it was. It didn't come from the source they thought it did. Or Joseph used a different translation method with the Book of Mormon than they expected. Those things are so irrelevant to what the point of religion is. And so I guess we just need to take upon us that individual responsibility of centering our religion in our relationship to the healer of the world and not to Joseph Smith or foundational historical moments.
Right. That reminds me of a quote from Wittgenstein, where he talks about the Gospels and why God didn't just have four really fantastic historians write down the Gospels, and he just says, he has these four people, and they're just trying to write the best history that they can, and sometimes there are contradictions or omissions, and he says it so that way we don't confuse the setting with what's actually taking place.
Right.
Like we don't get lost in the detail. That we miss the testimony of the Son of God.
Yeah.
Right. Which is the most important thing, the most essential thing.
Yeah.
Thank you. Appreciate it.